Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Wednesday morning lecture. I'm really delighted to see the size of the group that's turned out to hear a most impressive program, and I thank you all for coming. Our speaker this morning is Andy Lorenzen. Many of us know his wife, Gail, who looks after the community with Neighborhood Watch. She's here with us, and we're delighted to have her. But Andy's is the story that really is the main focus today. As a child, he had an exciting and adventuresome time, which unfortunately ended in Santo Tomas prison in Manila. And you've all read, I think, the description of his experiences as a prisoner of the Japanese in World War II. And so we're going to turn the program over to Andy, and you'll be able to see some of the interesting slides of his recollections. And so without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Andy Lorenzen.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with Peninsula seniors. It's always a delight to talk with seniors because I've read somewhere that 80 to 90% of all the history that has ever been written has been written in our lifetime. Just imagine how much easier it was for us in school to study history than it is for the kids today. But there is a girl named Harriet Rowan, 13 years old in Virginia, who decided as her 8th grade project to make a documentary about the teenagers in the Santo Tomas internment camp. She did a wonderful job. She got film footage from 1945 taken by the Signal Corps and juxtaposed that against interviews she had with ex-prisoners who were attending the grand opening of the MacArthur Museum in Norfolk. One of the people that she interviewed was Curtis Brooks. And Curtis Brooks had a rather interesting but sad experience. He and his twin brother were in Santo Tomas with their parents. In January of 1945, while we were still prisoners, his father died of starvation. Then, when we were liberated, he was taken hostage by the Japanese and held for 2 days. When he was finally released, he had another 2 days before the Japanese shelled the camp and his mother was killed. So this was the kind of thing that she showed in her documentary. And it went on to win a number of awards in the state and was entered in the national contest for her age group. But the first time she showed that documentary was to her 8th grade class. And after she had shown it, her teacher took her aside and said, "None of this happened, you know. This is not real." And that is a very sad commentary where the students know more about history than their teachers. But the fact is that during World War II, 14,000 Americans were held as prisoners by the Japanese in various camps throughout East Asia and Japan. I'll bet you that most of you people here can remember a lot about World War II. That you probably remember certain days that just today stand out vividly in your memory. Maybe it was Pearl Harbor, or the Normandy landing, or VE or VJ Day, or perhaps the day that President Roosevelt died. To me, the most memorable day was February 3rd, 1945. It started out as just another miserable, ordinary day, my 1,125th day as a prisoner of the Japanese. In mid-morning, I was out in the the shanty area, and I heard an airplane that sounded different from the airplanes we'd been seeing around the campus. It was flying very low and slow, and I looked back, and it flew past. The canopy was open. It was a Marine Corps dive bomber. The canopy was open. I could see the pilot and the gunner. I started to wave frantically as the plane went by, and the pilot grinned and waved back. The plane flew over the main building of the Santo Tomas camp, and it wasn't more than a few minutes before the word was spread throughout the camp that the gunner had dropped a message tied to his goggles. It said, "Roll out the barrel." Now that was very encouraging because, of course, the last line of that song is, "Because the gang's all here." We knew the Americans were nearby. We could tell because of the short-range fighter bombers that were attacking around the city around us. P-47s and P-51s would make diving attacks right outside the walls of the camp. We just didn't know where the Americans were. We didn't know how long it would be before we would be rescued. But the indication on the note was that it would only be a day or two more for us. That evening, at 5 o'clock, I had my dinner. We had 2 meals a day at that time. Breakfast was a very watery gruel called lugao, which was mainly rice and water. Dinner was laughingly called stew, and it consisted of a few green leaves floating on some very weak broth with some beans in the bottom. And our habit was to very slowly spoon up the greens and the broth until there was nothing left but the beans. And then we'd count them and eat each one individually. That day I had 8. After dinner, we had to go back to our dormitory. My mother and my sister and I walked painfully up the 3rd floor of the main building where our dormitory was, and we went through our twice daily humiliation, which was roll call. We had to line up in the hallway outside our dormitory in 2 ranks. And as the Japanese officer and the guards walked down the hall towards us, the monitor for our room called out, 1, 2, 3, bow. And we had to make a perfect bow. Hands stiffly to our sides and bent exactly perpendicular at the waist, feet together. After the monitor had given the count for the room and the guards moved on, then we were allowed to come up from the bow. It was a little disappointing because in that roll call, the Japanese acted perfectly normal. They acted as if there was nothing unusual going on. They were not concerned about Americans being in the region. So any indication that we'd had earlier that we were going to be rescued soon sort of deflated. After roll call, I went down to the washroom on the 1st floor of the building and then went outside until curfew. And it was one of those beautiful evenings in the Philippines. The sun had set, it was getting dark, and there was just a pink glow in the sky. And I had perhaps a half hour to enjoy those last minutes of the day before having to be locked up for the day. And as it darkened, we saw columns of smoke and heard explosions. But that didn't mean anything to us because the bombings had been going on for so long that we were now used to shooting and explosions and smoke. But the thing that was unusual was that we saw glare along the horizon that would brighten up and then darken again. And we felt, rather than heard, a very deep, low-pitched rumble that we could feel in our chests rather than hear in our ears. Curfew came and I went back up to the dormitory, and my mother and sister were sitting at a card table in the hallway, and I sat down with them. My mother pulled out that precious tin box where she kept her survival biscuits. These were biscuits that she had baked with black market soya meal and the corned beef from the care package that we got for Christmas in 1943. She baked it so it was so hard that the humidity wouldn't affect it, and she called it hardtack. She opened the box, and there were 2 biscuits left. She took one out and carefully divided it into 3 and gave each one of us a equal piece. We sat and ate that just as slowly as we could, savoring every crumb. And then she did something entirely uncharacteristic for this very thrifty, careful woman who had been keeping us alive for 3 years. She opened the box again and took out the last biscuit, saying, "What the heck? We're probably not going to need this after tomorrow." But how did we get ourselves into such a predicament? We lived a life of privilege and contentment in North China, in Tientsin. My father was a very influential businessman. He had lived all his life in China, and he knew just about everyone in the diplomatic and business community. But by the end of 1941, it became common knowledge that the Japanese were going to attack America. So on December 4th, he arranged for my mother, my sister, and I to be taken by ship to Hong Kong, because Tientsin was an occupied city by the Japanese. It had been occupied in 1937 at the start of the Sino-Japanese War. He didn't want us in a place where the Japanese occupied the city. We sailed into Hong Kong harbor on December 8th while the Japanese bombing was still going on at Pearl Harbor. The ship was given instruction to leave Hong Kong immediately and go to the nearest friendly port, which was Manila. On December 12th, we sailed into Manila Harbor in an air raid. The ship in front of us was hit by a bomb and was on fire, but we eventually got ashore, and after the ship left to find a safe haven in a cove on Bataan, it also was sunk, so we were stuck in Manila. At the end of December, General MacArthur had evacuated all of the U.S. troops out of Manila. In order to preserve what was then considered the Pearl of the Orient, the finest city in the Orient, he declared Manila an open city. On January the 2nd, the Japanese marched in unopposed and took possession of the city. 3 days later, they rounded us up and took us to the campus of the University of Santo Tomas. This was a 65-acre site that had several large buildings, which, being walled all around, 4 sides, was felt that it would be a good place for confinement of prisoners. Eventually, the camp became overcrowded. Probably something like 5,000 to 6,000 civilians passed through Santo Tomas. The first year or two were not too bad because we could procure food from the Filipino population by purchasing it. But at the beginning of 1944, the Japanese military police took over administration of the camp. And then all communication between ourselves and the Filipino population outside the wall were absolutely shut off. 1944 is called the Year of Starvation. Approximately 2,200 prisoners had been moved to another camp south of Manila called Los Baños. leaving about 3,800 of us in Santo Tomas. Rations were cut continually throughout that year until by the end of the year, we were only getting 2 meals a day. And I think it amounted to 600 or 700 calories per person. People were starving to death. In December of 44, 39 people died of starvation. In January, 42 more. And had we remained there, the starvation rate would have continued to increase. Starting in September of that year, and probably what instigated the even more harsh treatment by the Japanese, was that the Americans returned to bomb the city and the harbor. This was in preparation for the Leyte landings. And from September on, we had numerous air raids until it was just almost one continual air raid, with waves of bomber coming over every day, all day. By the beginning of January, we began to see the short-range fighter planes coming over. And unbeknownst to us, the 6th Army had landed at Lingayen Gulf, about 100 miles north of Manila. And that was on January 9th. MacArthur's entire focus was to recapture Manila. And ignoring all other opportunities for advance on the island, he had his armies drive south as fast as they could. But General Yamashita, who commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines, had concentrated more than 250,000 troops in the mountains of Luzon. And after the 6th Army had moved 40 or 50 miles south, they ran into the first elements of Yamashita's defense force. General Yamashita had a strategy, and that was he knew that eventually the American superior forces would defeat him, but his whole emphasis was to delay the Americans, to make it as difficult for them as possible to continue to occupy the island. And his philosophy was that as long as he could delay MacArthur in the Philippines, it would give more time for the home islands to prepare their defenses for the inevitable invasion of Japan. MacArthur was very disappointed when his troops bogged down. He had just brought in the 1st Cavalry Division from Leyte, and he felt that they were more aggressive than the 37th Infantry, who had been leading the attack up to that time. He went to General Mudge, who was the commander, and he told him, "Go to Manila, free the prisoners in Santo Tomas." And the instigation for that was that U.S. intelligence had intercepted a message from Tokyo to the local commanders in the Philippines to execute all Allied prisoners before they could be liberated. The first thing that had to be done, though, was to liberate the POWs at Cabanatuan. And so on the night of January 30 to 31st, the 6th Ranger Battalion infiltrated the Japanese lines and rescued the 518 prisoners in that camp. They were POWs who had been captured in Corregidor and Bataan and were too weak to be sent to the slave labor camps in Japan and Manchuria. It was a magnificent operation. No casualties on the side of the Americans. And it was depicted in the recent movie, The Great Raid. When those prisoners were brought back within the lines on January 31st, then MacArthur authorized the the 1st Cavalry's flying column to start its advance on Manila. It was led by the 800-man 44th Tank Battalion, who on 1 minute after midnight on February 1st broke through the Japanese lines and raced towards Manila. By morning of that first day, they'd gone through Cabanatuan, not even slowing down. At times, they were going 50 miles an hour down the central highway, down the central valley of Luzon. At other times, they were stopped by enemy defenses or blown bridges, and they had to back up and look for alternative routes. By the 3rd day, February 3rd, they had reached the outskirts of Manila in the late afternoon, where they were met by a company of Filipino guerrillas, who then led them through the streets of Manila to the gates of Santo Tomas. They arrived there at 8:30. What I had been seeing earlier in the day, the brightening of the sky, were flares that they were firing to light their way. The rumbling was tank treads on cobblestones. At their first problem, though, when they reached the gate, was that there was an iron arch across the top of the gate, which was too low for the tanks to go under. And while the battalion commander was studying the problem, a skirmish with the Japanese resulted in his being wounded, and the leader of the Filipino guerrillas being mortally wounded. While they were being dragged over to the central divider of the road in front of the camp, a tank lined itself up and broke through the wall, and the other tanks followed it along with trucks and jeeps, and they made their way towards the plaza in front of the main building of Santo Tomas. At that time, I was sitting at that card table up on the 3rd floor of the main building outside our dormitory, finishing that last survival biscuit. Sitting there, we heard screaming and shouting, very distantly in the very difficult to hear in the distance. But the sound moved up the stairways and down the hall, and fairly soon we began to understand the words that were being screamed. "They're here! They're here!" I jumped up and raced down the hall, also screaming those same words, ran down the hallway towards the main lobby of the main building, and only was able to reach the mezzanine half a flight up because of the crowd of people that had gathered on the stairs. But as I looked down, I could see that a tank had come through the double doors of the building with its gun pointed sort of in my direction. And standing around in the lobby were a bunch of bemused GIs with silly grins on their face, while the liberated prisoners danced around them and hugged them and made a big fuss over them. But our delight was short-lived because the Japanese garrison had retreated to the education building, which was right next door to us, and had taken 228 prisoners as hostages. They started firing on the American forces, and the American forces returned fire, lining up the tanks across the front of the building and just pouring in small arms fire into the building. The Americans were taking casualties, but the Japanese were having a worse time. And eventually they realized that they were in a very bad position, so they dispersed themselves among the hostages and the firing stopped. That night, was all quiet in the education building. The 800 troops of the 44th Tank Battalion staked out and dug entrenchments around the inside of the walls, because here they were, 800 troops surrounded by 26,000 Japanese. They didn't know whether the Japanese would counterattack. They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know the disposition of the Japanese in the city. The next morning, all was still quiet in a hostage situation, and more elements of the 1st Cavalry started arriving. They decided to send out mechanized and foot patrols to find out where the Japanese were setting up their defenses. And that evening, a foot patrol walking down a street not just a few hundred yards away from Santo Tomas was walking down the street, and they heard a voice. "Hey, are you guys Americans?" The patrol leader sort of was startled. He says, "Yeah." And the voice came back, "Hey, we're POWs. Can you get us out of here?" The patrol had stumbled on the Bilibid prison. They hadn't even known that it existed. They knew the prison existed. They hadn't realized it had been used as a POW camp. But it was very notorious because all of the prisoners who were taken from Camp O'Neill and Cabanatuan and shipped on the hell ships to the slave labor camps in Japan and Manchuria were all staged through Bilibid. And the patrol was not in a position to free those prisoners that night, but the next morning, the 37th Infantry finally arrived in Manila, and they had the honors of freeing the camp. In that camp were 800 POWs and 500 civilian prisoners. The next day, the negotiations were completed with the Japanese in the hostage crisis, and the American forces agreed to release the Japanese carrying their weapons and their wounded to a specific district in Manila that they had selected. And as they marched out of the camp, everybody cheered and had a celebration because now finally all 3,800 of us were liberated. The Japanese had chosen an area of the city where a Filipino guerrilla group was operating. They didn't know that, but the American forces did, and they tipped off the guerrillas that they were going to be releasing the Japanese. And within minutes of the release, a firefight erupted, and most of the Japanese were killed. Only just a very few survived. Two days later, General MacArthur came to visit the camp. At this point in time, Santo Tomas had become an enormous armed camp. We had artillery within the walls, we had tanks, we had many, many troops. And it was a central location, concentration of troops in Manila at that time. General MacArthur thought that just as he had surrendered Manila back in 1941, that the Japanese also would return the favor and give up the city and allow the American forces to take it. He arrived at about 10 o'clock in the morning. We had a big celebration, and he left to do whatever he was doing. His staff was planning a victory parade for the city, which would soon be free. But oh, how wrong he was, because not more than a half hour after he left, a Japanese shell hit the main building in Santo Tomas, and Japanese shelling started for the next 3 days, killing 18 of our prisoners, of our liberated prisoners, and wounding another 65, along with numerous soldiers and Filipinos who were in the camp with us. That day, the Japanese stiffened their resistance. In order to prevent or to slow the American attack, they blew up blocks of buildings and set them afire. And that night, from the 3rd floor of Santo Tomas, we could look out over the city, and the whole horizon was burning. This was the start of the Battle of Manila, and the 29-day battle was the most intense urban battle fought by American forces during World War II, leaving Manila the second most destroyed of the entire war, second only to Warsaw. The tragedy of the battle was that the Japanese were able to fortify themselves in the old, heavily walled Intramuros, the original 500-year-old city, and in the concrete buildings of the business district. And these were only 1.5 miles or 2 miles from Santo Tomas, so we had a front row seat to the battle. The tragedy was that many Filipinos were trapped within the Japanese fortifications. They wouldn't let them go. And some 20,000 Filipinos were killed in the crossfire. But even more horrible was that the Japanese went on a killing spree. They killed 80,000 people, shooting them on the streets, stabbing with bayonets, going into hospitals and murdering the patients and doctors and nurses. And that particular killing spree is now called the Manila Massacre. The one good thing that happened in this period was that the 11th Airborne Division, in an extremely well-planned attack, liberated the 2,200 prisoners at Los Baños, jumping into the camp and having a combined operations with guerrillas who emerged from the jungle. And this is a very little-known story, but I call it the third great raid, if you consider Cabanatuan, about which the movie was made. Santo Tomas is the second. Los Baños would be the third great raid, or the last great raid of the Philippine campaign. People ask me how I got so interested in the details of what happened in Manila. And it really all started several years ago when I decided to write a book about my parents' history and experience. They both had the most unusual lives, living in Europe and Asia, with many strange experiences, of which Santo Tomas was only one little part. But in doing so, I began to get a lot of statistics. Some of them I've quoted to you, about the number of people killed and the degree of the atrocities that happened there. Then in 2005, I learned about a tour to Manila, which was billed as the 60th anniversary of the liberation. And I joined the tour, and there were 50 of us, a strange group of people, because we included ex-prisoners from Bilibid, from Santo Tomas, from Los Baños, people who had been on the Bataan Death March, people who had been in the slave labor camps. And we all were able to exchange stories and provide a lot more information from their perspective, which was different from the one that I had. We were treated extremely well. We followed the route of the Bataan Death March. We went to Camp O'Neill, where the death march ended, walking the last 2 kilometers with a survivor of the Bataan Death March. We went to Cabanatuan. We went to Los Baños. We wanted to go to Bilibid, but it had been converted back into a prison, and they wouldn't let us in, and I guess we didn't really want to go in that case. But we heard so many stories, like Bob Wolferson, who was on the death march. How did he survive? He survived because in his K rations, they had the little packages of dried coffee that none of the troops wanted. So he collected them all, and during the march, he sucked on the dry coffee to give saliva in his mouth. The only water he could get was from stagnant water lying along the side of the road. He tried to scoop it up as he walked by. But rather than just drinking the water as he picked it up, he had a bottle of iodine, and he put some iodine in the water. And that prevented him from getting the dysentery that killed so many people on the march. And the other thing he said was that he never thought about the future. He only thought about now. He only thought about how he was going to walk the next 100 yards. And then that was the way he survived. We talked with another person who had been in Cabanatuan and talked about the horrible conditions there. We met Earl Dudley, whose father worked for the Navy, and his mother and he had been sent to Baguio where it would be safe. And on the first day of the bombing, they bombed Baguio because they thought MacArthur was there for a meeting. And his mother had her leg blown off, and he was crippled for life. Earl Dudley shares in-law duties with Les and Alice Chapin, who are here today. We met Sasha Weinsheimer Jansen. Now, many of you may recognize the name. She was the lady who narrated the story about Santo Tomas on the Ken Burns movie, The War. And she is very well known throughout the Philippines and the community who are ex-prisoners, because she's the one who leads these tours. Just the end before last, we had a reunion of prisoners up in Fremont, and again heard many, many more stories. I can't go into them all, but one interesting presentation by a researcher, a professor from the University of New York, who made a study of the women in the internment camps. She said, who fared best and who fared worst in these camps? And she concluded that the teenagers fared the best. Teenagers are naturally rebellious. And instead of rebelling against their parents, they now had the Japanese to rebel against. If the Japanese said, don't dance, they danced. The people who had the worst problem were probably about 3 when they entered the camp. Young, old enough to be aware, but not old enough to understand. And they got their anxiety from their parents, because the parents had to somehow get the children through the crisis. And I should add here that at the end of the Year of Starvation, there were parents who were making a decision. Would the mother or father be the best qualified to raise the children if the other one died? And then the one who was least qualified gave his or her ration to the other to keep them alive as long as possible, so after liberation they would be able to raise the children. Another thing that, of course, affected many of the children was that their parents had been in the military, and they were gone. Some of them never seen again. So they're being raised by one-parent families. And at one point in time in 1943, the Japanese came through and took out all men who had ever been in a military reserve or had worked for the military in any way, and they disappeared. So the children had some trauma involved. What happened to people after our liberation, after we came back to the States? At that time, there was no post-trauma stress syndrome. It hadn't been invented yet. And we were told, go back, get back on with your life, go back to being a normal person again. And so many people took that to heart, just integrated themselves into the schools or their community, and never talked again about their experience as Japanese prisoners. It is only recently that people have begun to talk, probably within the last 10 years. And at our reunion, there was an enormous number of descendants who came to the reunion. They were hungry to know what had happened to their parents. Why did Daddy do such strange things? Why was Granny so weird? And so they wanted to know more about that experience and to find out how they could research their own parents' experience for their own selves and their children. I know my own sister never talked about her experience. Her children didn't even know she was in a prison camp until my book was finished and they read it, and they were just amazed. And they have been deluging her with questions, and she's now coming out of her shell. She came to the reunion and for the first time was willing to talk with other people about the experience. But not all people survived without trauma. There's one person we know very well. Her younger sister was about 3 or 4, and she was traumatized in the camp. And later, she was a brilliant girl. She became a Fulbright scholar. But later, she couldn't handle her life, and today she's a street person. And it all comes back to the trauma that affected her while she was a child. I'm going to just show a few pictures very quickly here, just to give you a little bit of idea what the camp looked like. This is the main building of Santo Tomas as it looked in 1941 before it was used as the prison camp. The layout of the camp was essentially that we had the main building. The education building was right next to it, which was where the Japanese guards lived and where they held the hostages for during the liberation. This is the main entrance. The tanks, when they came, broke through the wall right here and came up to the plaza. And when the Japanese started shelling, most of the damage was done to this end of the main building, and a few shells landed over here in the education building. That was my sister and me in 1940, when we were still privileged and content people. This is how I looked in 1943. My father was being repatriated from China, and we thought we were going to be able to also be repatriated, so the Red Cross took a picture to show that I was still alive. This is what the prisoners looked at like when we were liberated. I mean, they were just nothing but skin and bone, just on the verge of starvation. Next. On that day when the hostages were released, we had a tremendous celebration. One of the prisoners had smuggled a flag into the camp when he was brought in. It was sewed up in a pillow. He brought it out, draped it over the canopy over the main entrance, and everybody cheered because that flag had been with us throughout our internment. Just after MacArthur left, a Signal Corps video or movie photographer was taking background footage across the plaza in front of the main building. He caught this picture of the first shell hitting the main building. He then panned in on 2 boys who were running from the plaza for shelter, and that one is me. This is what Manila looked like at the end of the battle. It's a not very clear picture, but there's not much to look at. When I look at the footage of the destruction to Manila and compare it to the footage or the pictures of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was dropped there, I can't see a lot of difference. They're both totally destroyed, flattened. The main difference, though, is that more Filipinos died in Manila than Japanese died in Hiroshima. In 2005, we went back for the 60th anniversary, and it was all very formal with a lot of ceremony. And this is the main building as it looked at that time. Here is a picture of me with Diosdado Huaytinco. He was the first Filipino guerrilla to enter Santo Tomas with the troops. It was his leader who was mortally wounded, and he was carrying him in to the surgery, and they were unable to save him. But here we are 60 years later. At the time, he was 22 years old. I was 9. This is Bob Wolfensberger right here, who survived the Bataan Death March. That is one of the Bataan Death March markers. It's 2 kilometers from Camp O'Neill, and from here we walked on into the camp, and that was a great privilege for Gail and me. This is Bob standing in front. The Filipinos are building a museum at Camp O'Neill, and this is him in front of a reconstruction of a guard tower. And finally, this is Sasha, who you might have seen on the war series. And this is the American Embassy, which was one of the defensive positions that the Japanese used during the Battle of Manila. You see dings in the flagpole here. It's the original flagpole. Those are all bullet holes. Alex, you and your family were in Manila and wound up in Santo Tomas. Can you tell us a little bit about your own experience? It's always wonderful to share experiences.
Well, I was in at 3. My parents both went in, and I was 3, my sister was 2. And according to what my mother said, we were allowed out of the camp before the bombing started to go to school. So we would come in and out all day long. But the stories I hear now from my mother was eating watery food, picking maggots out of the rice. As the war progressed, you got less and less food. Burning our shanty, burning pieces of wood from the shanty to have food, to have fire, to cook our meal, that type of thing. If a cat was missing, somebody ate that night, that type of thing. I think my dad went in with a watch and he gave that away for rice. We had to build our own shanty, and my dad was not handyman. I think somebody had to help him build our shanty. It was built up off the ground to keep the rodents out of our area. One of the Japanese liked, I guess they thought we were cute, and he would give us bananas periodically. My sister, we would play in the water. My sister almost died from typhoid drinking the sewer water. I know that my mother just refused to talk about it at all, because eventually she said they were told never to speak about what happened here. You are forbidden to speak about what happened, and they believed it, not to say anything at all. One night there was a knock on the door. This is really before the war really started, before the bombing started. My mother's friends and family would send us dried milk from the outside to our shanty. And there was a knock on the door one night, and this guard said, "Open up." My mom says, "No, it's past curfew, we can't open up." He says, "Please open up." And he hands my mother carnation non-fat milk. So there were, I guess, a few that had some compassion in that sense. But she didn't have to go in with us either. But she went in because my dad was not a citizen. He was a British subject, as I was during that time. And so she went in with us because he couldn't take care of us. And she told us stories about people that were spies in there, and they would, I forget, one was called High Pockets. There were High Pockets. And that person eventually got killed I just beheaded. I have a publication given to me just recently by some friends of my mom's that was in there, and it was a daily listing of the food rationing and how much people were allowed every month every month, a certain amount of rice, a certain amount of whatever it was, gruel. And as the war went on, you're starving. I'm emotional because I didn't really suffer as my parents did. And just to see this and see what that they went through, that's what gets me, because we really didn't know about it to this extent. I learned because of reading books, and seeing the war movies. But I wish you would have talked to us about it. I wish you would have.
Well, I think you brought up a couple of very important points, Alex. First of all, the greatest burden of anyone in the camp were the parents, because they not only had to survive for themselves, but they had to take care of the children.
That's right.
Another thing that you mentioned is the diseases. And I didn't mention earlier, but throughout our period in the camp, there was a lot of diseases. I mean, a lot of childhood diseases. There was dysentery, measles, diphtheria,
I got measles.
whooping cough. We all suffered and from that. And your point about teeth, yes, there was no calcium. There was no milk whatsoever. And the best that they could do was to squeeze coconuts, squeeze the juice from the coconuts to produce what milk that was saved for the children. For so many of the younger generation whose parents were in the internment camps, they become hungry for information about what happened to their parents. There are a number of organizations and books that have been written that will help people, the younger generation, to understand or to read about and research their parents' history. One of the organizations that can be very helpful is the Bay Area Civilian ex-POWs organization, which was started in the San Francisco Bay Area, but which now covers people all over the United States and for camps throughout East Asia, for people who were interned. At our reunions, the younger generation come out of the woodwork just very anxious to hear other tales because their parents are so reluctant to talk in any detail. And so those people who want to join this organization to take advantage of the information provided, I suggest that you apply for membership in Base POW and take advantage of some of the meetings and reunions we have that gather people from all over the country. Others may be interested in taking a trip back to Manila. And our famous person who organizes these trips is Sasha Weinsheimer Jansen. She works through Raja Travel in San Francisco, and she has a reunion trip or a liberation trip just about every year or two. And at these trips, she takes people to the various civilian concentration camps, to Corregidor, to Bataan, to Camp O'Neill, where the POWs were still dying in such many quantities after the Bataan Death March, to Cabanatuan, and to Santo Tomas and Los Baños. Joining one of these trips will be an enormous eye-opener, because the people who go on those trips are people who have researched the history of the camps and who are eager to exchange their information with others. This is the POW medal that the state of California had struck last year. Any prisoner of any war is eligible to get this medal. It shows a prisoner on his knees with a bar between his elbows and his hands tied in front of him. The words on the medal say, "For your honored service and sacrifice." I was recently elected as commander of the civilian ex-POWs, and in our reunion during February of 2008, when I took over the organization, at our reunion banquet, the former commander asked to make a presentation before I took over as Master of Ceremonies. He took out of a case this medal and put it around my neck. And I feel so proud to be able to wear a medal that is worn by people, mostly military POWs who've served all over the world and in many years of many wars, but to be able to join them in wearing this medal that was struck by the state of California. People ask, and particularly the Filipino people, are you still angry at the Japanese for what they did? And I think the best answer I ever heard was from that old gorilla that you saw the picture of. And he said, that was a long time ago, and we can now forgive. But we must never forget what happened here. And I think that reflects the attitude of all of the people who suffered through those years.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.